Paoli then from here. So that'll keep us connected, I guess. And possibly what I'd like to see is linking Paoli and Darby too. That would be interesting through nodes.
Wait, I'm sorry. Which one were you going to put on it?
No,
The other one?
but I think would be reasonable because I really can't hit Darby that well. And you were doing good when it was running in Darby.
Right.
So we get the new machine in Darby. You go back to putting your node at Darby, right? And then I'm going to put a node to Paoli.
Right.
From my house, from here. So that'll give us some coverage then.
Do you have an antenna for that?
Yep. I can hit Paoli with a wet noodle from here. So I'm only about 6 or 7 miles.
I was going to offer you the high gain beam. It has 3 elements on 2 meters and 4 elements on 70 centimeters, and can be it's end mounted, so it can be mounted either horizontal or vertical. Just change the U-bolt. I'm thinking of getting something more like a 10 or 12 element 440 beam for Darby.
Yeah.
And I was going to get a second one and point it at Paoli, but sounds like there's no need.
Well, we can talk about that. I'm certainly not want to make anybody feel that they can't experiment either, right?
Well, I thought you said something about a second. Were you thinking of making the 06 machine a second node?
No, I'm talking about Paoli.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we don't really have the very good access to antennas, and can't do anything with antennas at the Newtown Square. That's not going to work. It's basically stitched up, and that's the way it is.
Hey, Dylan, welcome.
Hey, how are you?
Dylan is a postdoc at Villanova. Just recently started there. Interested in getting involved in the club.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Postdoc and what?
Good for you, Jeremy.
I'm
Is
sorry.
that Steve?
I was asking postdoc and what? Are you in physics with?
Yeah, I'm in the physics department with Jeremy. I'm not working with Jeremy, just with one of the other professors, but I see Jeremy a lot for like the department events and whatnot. We do like some department service together as well.
What's your field, Dylan?
Well, I'm in astronomy. So the physics department has a lot of people who do astronomy research. So my expertise is mostly in like radio astronomy. So using like interferometers and things like that. But the work I'm doing at Villanova is more in the infrared.
My son did his PhD at Penn and postdoc at Max Planck in Stuttgart, and then at Harvard School of Engineering. His thing is soft matter, particularly liquid crystal behavior, and he's now working for a startup, and he only tells me the sketchiest stuff. So, all the
All right, should we get started? All right, so I want to welcome everyone. This is the February 2023 meeting of the Mid-Atlantic Amateur Radio Club. I'm Jeremy Carlo, N2 ZLQ Club President. So as we normally do, we'll go around with a round of introductions. So anyone out there, feel free to introduce yourself.
Okay, I'll start. Dennis, K3DS.
I'm Steve, K3FZT, home QTH, West Mount Airy, Philadelphia. And I'll be back there next week.
Emergency 172 Main Street.
This is Lou, WX3I.
This is Jim, W3JNF.
172 Main Street, Front Street.
I'm Bob, W3ZQN, and
Security?
Worcester.
I'm Joe, N3LMB.
A resident just called to let us know that
Bob, N3 JIZ.
is the
Dylan, KE0VIS.
Anybody else? All right, I think maybe we got
I guess he's not.
Sorry. I think I may have doubled with you.
Yeah, I thought I didn't hear Ned check in. Maybe I missed it.
I think he's finishing up another meeting. All right, so let's go to the treasurer's report. Lou.
Okay, good evening, everybody. We currently have in the bank $16,761.97. All bills have been paid. We basically haven't really had any bills since December, so we're all good with that. We do have the PO box coming due. I have to check and see how much that's going to cost. I know it's going up, but you know, it's still worth the money, I think. And currently on the membership rolls,
I think you just muted yourself.
sorry about that. I switched screens and it muted me. So basically 61 members, some new members, which is good. So we're getting some new members, but as Dennis said in his email, we still need people to renew if they haven't already renewed. So I think that's it. I'll send it back to you, Jeremy.
All right, thanks, Lou. Yeah, once again, if you're looking for the instructions to renew your membership, you go to the website, marc-radio.org, and you could find the instructions there to mail in your payment. Okay, so let's see, what have we got after that? Technical services, Dennis.
Okay, well, we have the 0613 repeater working well. We have the 445675 fusion repeater on the Pennsylvania digital wide net, which I've been using a little bit, and it seems to be working out. We're putting Eastern Pennsylvania on the map. That's all due to K3FZT's efforts, of course, as a remote node, because these commercial locations don't want to talk internet. So I think that's the way we'll have to do it. I've got to make a stop at Paoli within the next couple of weeks to swap out the DR1X that's there, put in a DR2X, and also upgrade some software in the controller, and then try to button everything back up again. Then I got to go over to 06 at Newtown Square. We had a PA remove disconnect, and then Jeff WN3A thought it was bad, so he actually took it out of the rack. And then he had back surgery, and I don't know what the status is. So I got to get a hold of Jeff WN3A and see where our amplifier is, and see if we can get it back on again. That's that intermittent problem that we had a couple of months ago, which has been cured apparently, from what I can tell, by not running the PA. So Jeff and I feel that there may be some thresholding in the exciter. Maybe we'll just give it another half a watt or so, and then see what happens. Personally, nobody's really noticed that we're only running 7 watts to the antenna. Everybody's perfectly happy with it, which is really interesting. The less power you run in a repeater, the more sensitive the receiver is. So that's the trade-off. Darby is a work in progress. We did, Steve and I did make it down there to install some equipment, and then immediately afterwards, the PA on the 444050 fusion repeater went. And I'm getting reports that people can hear the exciter. I know we can hear the exciter because I was copying it on Lansdowne Avenue as I was driving home. So apparently the PA has blown. Don't ask me why or when that happened. But we have a new DR2X to put in there. And then we have tremendous desensing on our flagship 14736 repeater. And I've been reading some blogs where people are complaining like mad about these Bridgecom 220 repeaters causing a lot of spurious signals. So the first thing might be to decapitate the 220 machine, not a big loss, and then see if that improves or at least the desense goes away at that point. They're mounted one on top of the other. That might be part of the problem too. So I'm looking into some shielding that we might put in the cabinet to try to make things a little bit RF tighter. So that's the current status of things.
All right. Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, it's interesting that it could be that the machines are right next to each other or that the feed lines are running parallel to each other. Could even be like a grounding issue that you're getting noise.
Well, the interesting thing is, let's see if we could put this in perspective. A couple of months ago, maybe a year or two ago, whatever, when the 14736 EF Johnson repeater circa 1985 finally gave up the ghost, we put the DR1X on 3.6 essentially, and it worked fine. And of course, there was no other repeaters running at the time. So we'll have to see what the story is. I don't think it's the feed line. The feed line there is really good. Hardline, Flexome hardline. The duplexers are good. The grounding is good. I really felt bad when I started to read these blogs. Just do a Google search on Bridgecom 220 repeaters generate noise, and there's all kinds of different threads where people are talking about it. So that's not a good sign. What can I tell you? We'll see how it works out.
All right. Thanks, Dennis. We're always keeping on top of things. So keeping our repeaters running. All right. Next up, we're going to have in his first ever official report, we're going to have Jim telling us about public service.
Good evening, everyone. Public service events. The first one coming up is going to be the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Run at Norristown Farm Park. It is scheduled this year for March 25th. It's in the past, it's been in the fall, which has always been rather chilly, but hopefully this will be much better. I do need to get with Bob after the meeting to see if he has the number of the person that he gave me. I have not been able to find that, but we should be okay. And I'll start promoting that with emails and things like that. I'm going to get on other club nets and promote it because I don't want to get there and have 3 people, 4 people. I want to try to build our public service. After that, the next one is I believe the Penn Win. So let's get this one moving and we'll go from there. So that's where we're at.
Let's see if we can get it on the website, especially the calendar and then the special page on public service so people know what to do about it.
Right.
We can check for interference problems on our event dates.
Well, we know we have an interference problem with the breakfast. So I guess we'll pin that down at the board meeting next week or the next board meeting. Is that's
on the 14th, but hopefully
14th.
we can get the date settled before that.
Oh, no, I'll have the date settled tomorrow, one way or the other, just to make sure. I just wanted to try to get the person in the know rather than start from scratch and talk to somebody that doesn't know what's going on. So.
All right. Thanks, Jim. Sounds like we got a good start for the spring. So we got the Norristown Run on March 25th. I think the Penn Win is usually sometime in April.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And then there's, of course, there's a Memorial Day parade. And do we have other events in the spring? There were a couple of the MS walks, but I think those have been sort of combined.
Right. I'm not sure. I haven't gone through all Bob's paperwork. I mean, if you want to chip in there, Bob, you're more than welcome to.
And I'm on mute. Yeah, there's the French Creek Racing Group. They have an event in May. I believe it's May 21st, Sunday, May 21st. I don't know if we're going to do that or not. Typically, it's been a real hard sell to try to get people to go to that event. So maybe it's time to separate ourselves from that. And then, of course, there's the Radnor Memorial Day Parade. That's on the Memorial Day, which this year is the 29th. That would be May 29th this year. And I think that's about all I can think of off the top of my head. I did get that email from you, Jeremy, about the MS walk in media, which probably is the one that's going to happen in French Creek, or not French Creek, but Ridley Creek State Park. But that's we'd have to investigate that. We've never actually done that one. Typically, the Marple Newtown Club or the Delaware County Aries Group is the ones who worked that particular event, and I don't understand why they sent you that information. Thanks for sending it to me, but I've been dealing with them for how many years, and it's like I fell off the face of the earth. But anyway, that's something we'd have to kick around a little bit to do the MS event and get some more information on that one. So.
Well, just to chip in, we are not in a position to do that. And I think Jim Goldman from the Marple Newtown, he was heavily involved in that. So that's not going to be on the list unless somebody has strong feelings about it.
And unless we offer to help them with that event, and then maybe they can help us out a little too. One hand washes the other.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'm just looking online, the Penguin 5K. Actually, this is 2022. It was actually in June. So I wonder if they're moving those back.
Well, I didn't see any specific date, so I'm not sure at this point.
I'm seeing another website saying April 1st, 2023, but it says estimated.
Right.
So that might be coming up right after Norristown.
Well, that'll be the second one, yes. That's always a good event too. And it's close for everybody. It's kind of right in the middle of everything. So once I pin down the Vietnam veterans, I'll put out a list of every event with all the dates and times.
I got a question.
Yes.
Yeah, Fred, go ahead.
Do you know who's doing the Broad Street run?
I have no idea.
Okay. And the second thing is that our new officers at Marple Newtown are trying to get the club more active. So we'll see if they are, going to sponsor the MS walk or not. I haven't heard anything about it yet from Marple Newtown.
Well, I guess I could call Ann or Aaron and see what the deal is. I mean, that's probably a good idea.
Yeah, well, if they're gung-ho to try to get people more active in the club.
We have the same problem.
Right.
Perhaps a joint venture.
That's why I was suggesting maybe on public service, we could join efforts in some of these events.
It's a good idea.
Yeah, good idea.
Well, I check into their net at least 6 days a week. So once I'll get an announcement together after I talk to Ann or Aaron. I'm not sure who's doing the public service, and maybe we can do that. But I'll certainly announce it on the net every morning at the 8:30 the morning net. So They have quite a few members also that maybe would be interested in getting out. It's something I don't think they really got into that much, except for the one at Ridley Creek, which Jim Goldman was, I believe, heavily involved in. So, any other questions?
All right, thanks, Jim. Well, we're off to a good start for public service, and you're taking the ball and running. Bob has kept us running for many years, and hopefully we'll have a number more years in public service to go. All right, quick little announcement about the nets. As most of you know, we do our nets every Wednesday and Sunday evening at 8:30 p.m. And that's on the 147.06 and 145.130 repeaters. So the nets, the last few weeks, our turnout has been a little bit down. So if you haven't checked into the net in a while, please do so. We're hoping to get some more folks involved in the net. And finally, we are looking for some net control stations as well. So if you're interested in doing that, you can contact myself, or you can contact Herb, K3YR. You can usually catch one or both of us on the nets. So those are the nets. Quick announcement about the breakfasts. They have gone fairly well the last few months. I wasn't at the most recent one. Does anyone who was there want to say anything?
Well, if nobody else wants to, I'll certainly say something. We had 6 people, and it was a nice event. We had some nice conversation. The food was good. The service is good, and it's kind of a central location for everybody. So I personally would like to see, more people there. They have plenty of space. So, if we get 30 people there, I think that they can accommodate us for that time. This time we were in the little room where the real estate office presentation was last time. It was nice. Anybody else that was there? Go right ahead.
Yeah, I think this is far superior to the last location we have. Even if it's another few minutes for me to drive to it, it's worth it.
But I miss the sarcastic waitresses.
Yeah, right.
That's true. And that's well worth the 10 minutes. But yeah, okay. You can't have everything. I'd rather have good food and good service than sarcastic waitresses.
You don't get the extra special sauce in your food, though.
Yeah, maybe you should do it as some Tabasco for your breakfast, Dennis.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Brian.
If you wish, I can send a notice out for the breakfast as I do for the nets.
Yeah, just hold off a little bit on that, because the next one is scheduled for March 25th, but I think we're going to have to move that, because that does conflict with the first public service event. So if that's the case, we're going to move it back to March 18th. Hopefully we'll have that nailed down.
That's what I had in mind when I said send out the notices.
Yeah.
That would clarify any last minute change. We've had a problem with duplicating events on the same day, conflicting, conflicts, because there's nothing you can do about when these public service events happen. The veterans, for example, are not going to change for us, but we can adapt in some way with things like breakfast to move that around.
Right.
And I thought the email might clarify for the people so they know exactly whether it's happening or not.
Well, that's true, Brian, but give me until tomorrow. I want to get a hold of them just to confirm, and then I'll give you a call or send you an email. And I think it would be okay at that point, Jeremy. What do you think if I get it nailed down to change it?
Yeah, once we're confirmed that we'll be there on the 25th in Norristown, then we'll move the breakfast.
Yeah, I wasn't planning to send the note out until a couple days ahead of time, because people just forget.
Yeah.
As I do with the nets, I send the note out a couple days ahead of time. I do the same thing for the breakfast. So you got plenty of time, almost a month to figure it out.
Okay. All right, so let's see, what other items do we have? Field day, still a bit of a ways off, but do you want to say anything about field day?
Well, Lou and I had a conversation at breakfast that we still haven't confirmed the location. They haven't had their meeting, but I don't anticipate any problem with that. Do you, Lou? I don't think we're going to have an issue. He's on the wrong screen.
There you go. I'm here now. Um, I don't anticipate any problem. We do have a new president, so the regime is different now, but I don't think he'll raise too much. I mean, I think we're fine the way it is. So, but I'll let you know.
Do we ever make a donation to the fire company for good courtesy afterwards? Should we, for example?
Well, I mean, we pay 150 for the privilege, so
Right.
if we want to do more than that, we could do it. But they are getting paid.
Okay, good. Well, then they should be happy.
Yeah, I think 150 is enough. The other thing that I brought up at breakfast, I may have a conflict for field day weekend, so that's something we can discuss further at the board meeting, but I'll have everything done ahead of time. There shouldn't be any issues whatsoever. The equipment's all at Brian's house now, so it's kind of easy to get at it and get it up there. So more to follow on that.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
Right
how
now, I
about-
do not have a conflict for field day, so there shouldn't be any problem with picking up the equipment. I will need, as I did last year, I'll need people to help transport it because I don't have the capability to move all our stuff.
Right, and I think we whittled down some of the stuff. We don't have the big antennas in the masts and all that. So, if we get a couple, 2 or 3 people throw a bin or 2 in their car, we're good to go.
As I recall, there's no large objects there.
No.
It's just that there's more than I can fit in my Volvo.
Right. Like if you get 2 or 3 cars and each person put 2 bins in their car or 2 or 3, it doesn't take up that much space. So it's very convenient to go to Brian's and grab a few bins and take it up there. So I'm sure we'll be fine with that.
And if you need to pick it up the day before, that's okay too.
Well, we normally pick it up on Friday. So
I'm just saying, if somebody needs to, for whatever reason, wants to pick it up on Thursday or Wednesday, well, Wednesday might be a problem, but Thursday, not a problem.
Okay.
Just
very
coordinate with me ahead of time.
Sounds good. How about Hamfest? That's even further off. Bob, did you have anything?
We've got some good news. Over the weekend, I contacted 5 card checkers, and long story short, we have a card checker by the name of Bill Dobson, N3WD, who is willing to come to the Hamfest. He does DXCC and WAS and something else that's on the email. So that's the first piece of the puzzle for getting the Hamfest flyer together. We've got the card checker. And then I guess I also called over the weekend Kim Souter from KFC, and she has not called me back yet. I just wanted to triple check the date, make sure we're good for August 13th. So as soon as I get back, she gets back with me on that, and I get that together, then I think we can start to redo the Hamfest flyer for this year. And then I'd like to get them printed up, and then we can start getting the Hamfest schedule list together to take flyers to the Hamfest. I am kind of I believe that we really need to do that. We need to go to Hamfests for at least the next 5 years to get people's thinking again, that the date has changed. I think I read somewhere that there's some psychological thing. It takes like six years to make a habit, or 6 years to break a habit, or something like that. And so we've already done 1 year. And so I think if we do it for another 5 years, just keep hitting the Hamfests, and pretty soon everybody will, always remember that, well, it's the second week in August for MARC. So that's what that's where I'm kind of headed right now. We just got to get the Hamfest flyer going, and then we'll work on the food vendor, and get. We also need to work on the PA system. That's another thing that hopefully Kim will be able to update me on, is the status of the outdoor speakers, because we really took a bath on them last year. So we got to figure out, what we can do with that. And also, I believe Rich, I think it's called AA3RC, I think, mentioned he would be willing to help out, trying to work on a RF link for some remote PA speakers. And so I'd like to try to start working on that too. But I'll have to get with Rich, I guess.
When Bob said Kim from KFC, I'm thinking, what the hell is Kentucky Fried Chicken have to do with our field day?
That could be our food vendor solved.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Thanks, Bob. Seems like we're well on the way. All right. Does anyone have anything else for the good of the club before we move on to our presentation? All right. Doesn't sound like it. So let's move on to our speaker for the evening. I'm very pleased to have our very own Dennis Szilagyi, K3DS, our technical services chair. And he's going to be telling us about what's all this digital voice stuff. So take it away, Dennis. I think, Dennis, you're muted.
Jeremy, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Right. Okay, here we go. I hope. Let's just do it. Come on. Okay, there you go. Okay, that should be full screen now, I hope. All right. It occurred to me that we have a new phenomenon in amateur radio for the last couple of years, and that's this digital voice stuff. So what I thought I would do, and then Steve is going to follow up in 2 months on the application side, all the wonderful things that we can do with it and all the wonderful things that he is doing with it, with the fusion nodes and all that. But I thought I would get under the hood a little bit and take a look at some of the things that we have in the technological side when we start talking about digital voice. The interesting thing is, of course, that if you pick up your cell phone, it's been digital voice for at least since about 1996, when IS-95, the last analog cellular telephony system went out. So in the cellular telephone side of the coin, people have been doing digital voice for a long time. And you might be surprised to see how long we've been doing digital voice here in the amateur radio ranks too. It's going on 22 plus years currently anyway. So that's the idea behind this particular talk. Okay, there you go. So amateur radio communication obviously began, we all know that, with Morse code, but of course Morse code is a digital signal. It's an encoding system in which you send letters by on-off keying of an RF carrier, and certainly that was a digital mode right out of the box more than 100 years ago. And of course, here's a nice photo of a spark gap transmitter and receiver, which was rather primitive, but that's the way it was in the teens, the 20s, and things like that, as we started to get amateur radio organized. And of course, that was a digital mode to begin with. However, amateur radio soon adopted analog amplitude modulation, because I guess that sounded more friendly to be talking to people. And it was basically a copy of the AM modulation that was then used for entertainment radio broadcast. Remember, we did not have FM broadcasts in the 1920s and 30s, early 30s anyway. So we had amplitude modulation. If you don't know what the scheme of things are, so that's this little graphic up here, modulating signal in red, it's your voice or music signal, whatever it is, a continuous carrier signal, and you impress the amplitude on the carrier. And interestingly, it's sort of like a reflected image. If you notice, the up and downs and all that are basically copied in the amplitude variation of the carrier. We call that a modulated signal. So that's what AM looked like. And here's a nice picture of a AM transmitter receiver, which were obviously a bit more complicated than the Spark receivers, but people were very interested in being able to at least talk to one another in that sense. So analog, that was AM, double sideband AM. But what came along rather early, you probably didn't know this. I hope you didn't know this. I always found this interesting. Analog single sideband amplitude modulation was also developed early. The first US patent for single sideband modulation was filed in 1915. Which is really even an antecedent to AM modulation and broadcast technology in the 20s. And of course, by single sideband, what we mean is that a regular AM signal has a carrier, and then we have our upper and lower sidebands, and people noticed early on that there was redundancy in the upper and lower sideband. We noticed it as hams a couple decades later because that gave us many more frequencies that we could talk on. But interestingly, the patent for single sideband was in 1915, and the US Navy was actually experimenting with single sideband before World War I in ship-to-ship communication. So SSB itself first entered commercial service in 1927 on the transatlantic radio telephone circuit between New York and London with an antenna farm in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. I grew up in Trenton. And I remember seeing this once upon a time. It turns out this is a subdevelopment now with all kinds of houses and stuff on it. But as you can see, in 1927, it was a little bit barer out there, basically just farmland and open territory. But that was the antenna array that people were using for radio telephone service using single sideband in 1927. Now, as hams, we got involved with single sideband pretty much after World War II. Because of all the experiences of the commercial ventures and things like that. Amateur radio operators began experimenting with analog single sideband after World War II. And it was really helped in one sense by this fellow, General Curtis LeMay, who was actually W5EZV. He was the commander of the Strategic Air Command, and he dictated that single sideband will be used as the radio standard for its aircraft in 1957. So that certainly gave it a big boost. And then, of course, the commercial manufacturers for the military domain got involved. So here's a Collin KWM1 HF single sideband transceiver from 1957. So we quickly adopted that as quickly as we could get our either homebrew or our manufacturing arm going. Then a little bit later, and another decade later, we picked up on another modulation technique, which had been actually invented in 1936. So amateur radio adopted analog frequency modulation, which was invented by Edwin Armstrong, which is quite a character in his own right. U.S. Army Signal Corps and has quite a storied career and quite a tragic death, actually, too. You should read all about it if you get the chance. So in the 30s, FM was promulgated by Armstrong as a good way of having public service radio and things like that. And public service radio quickly adopted it. And of course, we adopted it as hams a little bit later. Usually I look at FM. This is a Regency transceiver circa probably 1967 or something like that. It's a crystal controlled 2-meter transceiver. So we basically got on the FM bandwagon as we began using what I call junk in the trunk, old taxi cab transmitters in the trunk and stuff like that. And then a little bit more modern stuff came along. So the resurgence of FMs really came along with repeaters in the VHF and UHF band starting in the mid-60s. So a little bit about Edwin Armstrong. He died in 1954 very tragically. He took a unfortunate way of ending his life because he was being harassed in patent suits. But he was an American electrical engineer who developed not only FM, but also the regenerative receiver. That's the one where you would set the feedback and make it sensitive by having a feedback system. And also the super heterodyne AM receiver, tremendous improvement over the regular heterodyne single conversion receivers at the time. So here's one of the schemes from his patent applications. Here he's sitting on a beach. This beach is actually in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and he has his radio here on the beach, dapperly dressed. This is his wife. And obviously he's probably the only one on the beach that had a radio at the time. Edwin Armstrong held 42 patents, received numerous awards, and he also was the recipient of the first Medal of Honor awarded by the Institute of Radio Engineers. And here's his 20-cent postage stamp, and if it's 20 cents, it was a while ago. Okay, now getting back to ham radio. Although amateur radio, CW Morse code, especially RTTY, and later audio frequency shift keying, AFSK, packet radio, and also more current modes like WSJT, the weak signal modes, FT8 and things like that, are digital text modes. They are not digital voice modes per se. So that's what we want to talk about is digital voice. And this, of course, is some equipment. Here's a model 15, I think it is, radio teletype here. There's one of the ubiquitous terminals that we were running on packet radio back in the day. And of course, Morse code too. Now let's look at voice. A digital voice mode requires a couple of things, and that's what we're going to talk about here from the technical point of view. It requires sampling, quantization of an analog voice signal, which then produces digital data, and we'll talk all about that, followed by compression. And we have to compress because the amount of data that's available would overwhelm the bandwidth that's available. We just can't be a pig about it. So we have compression to try to limit our transmission bandwidth, especially within current allocations. So here's a typical voice signal. If I were to put up a voice signal out of a microphone and an amplifier on an oscilloscope, this is what I would see. You see some endemic types of things that you would see. You see various amplitudes. You also see long periods of pause, for example, not even necessarily between words when people stop talking, but even within the syllables that are actually being represented. So the first thing we want to do is take this voice signal, which is an analog, continuous analog signal, and we want to sample it, and then we want to quantize it. So let's talk about that. So how do we sample a signal? Well, one thing is the process of sampling is when we take periodic samples, which means at like a clock every so often, of an analog signal such as voice. And when the piece of equipment that can do this is actually not a digital piece of equipment by any means. It's an analog piece of equipment called a sample and hold device. And what it can do is it basically goes out, grabs a value of the continuous input analog signal, and then holds it for a period of time. So here's an example. I've got an analog waveform here in light gray, and my sample and hold comes along, and it samples the signal, and then it holds it. It holds it for an appropriate amount of time for the next level of processing. You can build these very easily. You can build these out of an op-amp. An op-amp comparator is one way to do it, as long as you can put a capacitor to hold the value. So that's typically what we would have in a sample and hold device. Now, these days, the sample and hold device is never discrete. It's always built into something else, but that certainly gives you an idea of what it's really all about, sampling and holding. Now, that's not digitization. That's basically just an analog manipulation of the signal. The next step is quantization. So we have sampling followed by quantization. These sampled signals are then converted to a digital value, and the device that does that is called an analog to digital converter, and you can get them in single chip representations, if you will. So in blue, we have some sort of a sinusoidal signal that we're trying to sample. And we see that we sample and hold it. So basically we get this staircase representation, which is kind of a crude representation, but we try to get as many staircases as we can. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But we then present these staircases, if you will, to the analog to digital converter, and out pops a bunch of digital values, if you will, each representing the arbitrary waveform at that particular point in time. So here we have a time scale along the horizontal, and the vertical scale shows digital numbers, and I'll talk about that in a second too. This happens to be a rather crude AD converter. It's only 3 bits of resolution, as we'll see. After the sampling and quantization, we are going to discuss why do we need compression. But first of all, what is compression? Compression processes the original data rate of the digital values, and we'll talk about that in terms of bits per second of the voice signal. So we have an analog voice signal, we sample it, we quantize it, and we end up with so many bits per second representing the signal. And the hope is that by compression, we can somehow reduce the number of bits per second, therefore effectively limiting the RF transmission band. We'll see that in a second. So the original data comes along, it's got all these wonderful bits, and somehow we're going to try to squeeze them down into a lossy but still representative way of representing what the original data was. And we're going to be talking about the device, which is endemic in amateur radio these days. It's called the AMPE, Advanced Multiband Excitation Processor. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So voice data comes in, we have a processor that processes it, and out comes compressed digital data for D-star, DMR, and fusion, which we'll talk about. So that's our input side. But we also need the reverse. If we're going to have compression, then we also need decompression. Decompression attempts to restore the original data rate of the compressed digital value in bits per second of the voice signal after reception. So we have a compressed data, fine, but we're not going to try to put that back through a digital to analog converter and try to listen to it. We want to try to go in the opposite direction and try to expand it, and it's called decompression. The same device can actually do that too. So input data, digital data comes in and it pops out as analog data at the other end that we can then listen to. So that's compression and then decompression. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about the different steps. The first step was sampling. In other words, a sample and hold device, if you will. So the analog voice signal is sampled, the value is recorded at a fixed interval, and that interval is called the sampling period. For communications quality voice signals up to about 3 kilohertz, the sampling rate is taken to be about 8 kilohertz, or the time step is about 0.125 milliseconds, or 8 kilohertz. This is the same standard that's applied to digital telephony, for example. We're resulting in sampling every 8 kilohertz, if you will, for the actual voice signal that comes in, even in what you would call telephony or even cellular telephony. After the analog voice signal is then sampled, the recorders are now quantized, which they're converted to a digital value by this analog to digital converter. So let's look at this example and we'll come up with some metrics then. The example here is this analog sinusoid in red. It's only quantized to 3 bits, because if I look at that, I only have 3 bits of representation going from all zeros to 111. And if I count the number of levels, I get 8 possible values, because 2 to the third is actually 8. So we say there are 8 possible values of this waveform, which are all now being sampled at the sampling period T sub s, which we said was 0.125 milliseconds, or 8 kilohertz. So quantization accuracy, obviously we would like to have as many bits as we can, is then affected by the trade-off of 2 things. I can sample quicker if I want to try to get it to be less crude, and therefore I can also have more bits in my sample. So let's define something called the data rate. The data rate is the number of bits in each sample, whether it's 3 bits or 8 bits or 16 bits, divided by T sub s, or if you will, multiplied by the sampling rate, but you could divide by the sampling time. And the answer comes out in bits per second. So for a 3-bit example here, there are 3-bit binary numbers, 111 all the way down to 000, and their decimal equivalents. This is called straight binary encoding. There are other types of encoding systems, but not to make it too complicated, let's just go with that. Let's look at this particular system. If I have 3 bits, my 3-bit example, I could then say, well, if I'm going to do it at 8,000 samples per second, or 1 over T sub s is 8,000, I end up with a whopping 24,000 bits per second. And even that's way too crude to have a reasonable voice signal, and that's 24,000 bits per second. But for a reasonable sounding voice, through experimentation on the telephony system, when it converted to digital transmission, 8 bits of resolution is used, as in telephony, resulting in a whopping 64,000 bits per second, or 64 kilobits per second. Now here's the problem. Simple modulation techniques for binary digital data are affected by taking these bits and then doing something to a carrier, because we have to put it as a transmission mode. So the way we do it is by putting that information, the digital bits, on the amplitude, the phase, or the frequency. And we call that amplitude shift keying, phase shift keying, or frequency shift keying. We're given some shorthand notation. B stands for binary, ASK is binary amplitude shift keying, binary phase shift keying, and binary frequency shift keying. So these are the primitive ways of sending digital data by just assigning them to amplitude, phase, or frequency, if you will. And here's what these signals look like in the time domain. If I have binary data that's rolling along like this, binary 1, binary 0, notice it's in a sequential serial format. For binary amplitude shift keying, this is called on-off keying, actually. It's one of the simplest modes. Every time I have a binary 1, I turn the carrier on. Every time I have a binary 0, I turn the carrier off. And if I have 2 1s in a row, then fine, I just keep the carrier on. If I have 2 zeros in a row, I just keep the carrier on. So that's called binary amplitude shift keying. Binary phase shift keying is a little bit, and what we notice here in binary amplitude shift keying is that the amplitudes are varying. You either have full scale amplitude or no amplitude at all. For binary phase shift keying, we don't play with the amplitude. In fact, the amplitude remains the same throughout, but we change the phase, and phase runs from 0 to 360 degrees. So one common way of having phase shift keying is to have a binary 1 represent a phase shift of 0 degrees with respect to the carrier, and a binary 0 representing 180 degree phase shift. You can have other variations. You can have minus 90 and plus 90 or any other variation in between, but usually 180 degrees between their binary phase shift keying representation. So what we see in the waveforms are that we have a carrier component, usually running quite faster than this. And when we have a transition, then we get an immediate phase shift to the new phase angle for the transmission time as expected, like binary 0. And if we have 2 1s in a row, then the phase doesn't change, etc. So that's called binary phase shift keying. Binary frequency shift keying is the last representation in which we have 2 different frequencies as opposed to a phase shift. So for binary 1, we pick a particular frequency. And if we have a binary 1, we send that frequency. And then if we have a binary 0, we send the other frequency. So that's shown here in the graphic by having 2 different waveforms. This obviously is supposed to be a lower frequency. And we can see that the amplitude also does not change, unlike binary amplitude shift keying. So that's the 3 fundamental primitive ways of transmitting binary data: amplitude, phase, or frequency. So let me give you the backstory here. Binary amplitude shift keying and binary phase shift keying require transmission bandwidths 4 times the data rate. And that would only be for 95% of the power enclosed in the spectrum. So I have to have a bandwidth of 4 times the data rate. Hold that thought. Where on the other hand, binary frequency shift keying is even worse. It requires a transmission bandwidth of 4 times the data rate, in addition to twice the frequency deviation. Frequency deviation is how far apart these 2 different carrier components are, F1 and F2. So that's 4 times the data rate plus frequency deviation. And therein lies the rub. Because a transmission bandwidth of 4 times the data rate, if we start off at 64 kilobits per second, remember we're not talking about compression yet, would end up with a whopping 250 kilohertz if we tried to do BASK and BPSK, and even worse for BFSK. Well, you can't get 250 kilohertz of bandwidth, okay? That's a quarter of a megacycle, and that would be totally unacceptable for amateur radio use, and therefore we have to have data compression. So that's the last support that we need for digital voice. So we have sampling, quantization, followed by compression. So if somehow the original 64 kilobits per second, which we already said can't be supported, could be substantially reduced by compression, then as a result, the transmission bandwidth would fall by the same rule. It's still going to be 4 times the data rate, but if the data rate's lower, it means the bandwidth will be lower.
Dennis,
Yes.
maybe kind of a silly question. So for the amplitude and for the frequency shift keying, it's pretty obvious which one is the 0 and which one is the 1. But in the case
no,
of
that's not obvious at all. Let me warn you that you have to know what the protocol is, because I can transmit, I could say that no carrier here or amplitude equals 0 is actually a binary 1. So people are very, very careful about knowing what the protocol is that you're actually transmitting. Go ahead.
So well, once we agree on the protocol, then it's obvious.
Right.
But in the case of the phase shift keying, I
Right.
mean, it's possible to just transpose the 0 and the 1.
Well,
most
it's
people-
even worse than that because phase, not only do you get phase shift keying, but you also get variation of phase if you move the position of the distance between the transmitting and the receiving antenna, right? So therefore, you could be starting off with 0 and 180 degrees, perfectly fine, and then find out that when you go to receive it, it's at plus 30 and then 180 degrees around from there on the other side. You can get this built-in phase shift just in the transmission mode, right?
So if
So
you're
not
moving or if you have multipath or something.
We might
like
have to
that.
agree, we might have to agree that it has to be 180 degrees apart, but we may not be able to know what the reference angle is when we receive it. And that's part of the synchronization problem. Okay.
Or are there algorithms or something that settle that out? So you know which one is the 1 and which one's the 0?
And that would have to be agreed upon ahead of time, as far as which one would be the 1 and which one would be the 0. But for example, if I had 0 and 180 and BPSK, right? 0 degrees, 180 degrees. And then we just so happen to have a path and I receive it as plus 45 and 45 plus 180, 225, right? So 45 degrees and 225 degrees. The protocol would tell me that the one angle, 45, would be, say, a binary 1, and the other angle would be the binary 0. But I would still have to rotate that in order to get the demodulation correctly. So there are phase lock loops and all that will do that rotation and basically restore the reference angle back down to 0, so you can tell which one's which. One of the ways that we get binary transmission, and again, I could go on and make it a lot more complicated, but in order to do synchronization, we usually have a header file that we send, which is like preconceived understanding data, certain representations of binary bits, which are not information, but they're designed to do synchronization, which means that the receiver can lock onto that, basically perform all of its synchronization tasks and actually figure out what the phase angles are. Okay.
So there is something periodically that says, hey, by the way, this is a 1 and this is a 0, right? This is phase angle of 0.
Yep.
And then every so often, like it refreshes it.
Every so often, it keeps changing the synchronization, especially in a mobile environment. You're constantly getting a reference angle change and you have to constantly resynchronize. So synchronization information is usually transmitted along with everything else, just a part of the overall format of it. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, I never really thought about that before.
Well, I think about it all the time, actually. So
basically what you're doing is sending a big block of data and there's a header that has the metadata that says how to interpret it.
well, it's not only metadata, it's a known sequence of bits that people lock onto. So if I send you a series of binary 1s and 0s and we know what that's supposed to look like, I can search in my received data and lock onto it. And once I've locked onto it, now I'm now synchronized anyway. Okay.
I was using metadata in the generic sense.
Okay. All right.
The other thing is, if unless there's an assured element of randomness in the 0s and 1s, if you had a long string of 1s or a long string of 0s, you could get into a timing problem.
Yes. Well, can I tell you that if it wasn't random, it wouldn't be information. I keep telling my students that, because if we know what the data is, I'll just write it down on a piece of paper and give it to you. It's a lot easier than trying to transmit it. But yes, long sequences of 1s and 0s are a problem. And what we do in order to remove that is we actually interweave the data. This is another layer of digital communication where we take these blocks and then try to make them a little bit more random, Brian, as you were saying, by actually doing what's called interweaving. When students take a first course in digital communication, they think they know everything. And then in the second course, they find out they know nothing as far as how it actually works. Well, that's the way it goes. And the graduate students are even worse off. So what can I tell you? Okay, so back to the pack.
Well, this is one case where encryption helps.
Well, encryption does help because it makes it a little bit less, like you say, we have long strings of 1s and 0s, for example. That's a killer.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've all decided that 256 kilohertz is not going to fly. You can't have a 1/4 megahertz of bandwidth just for your digital signals. We have to do data compression. Okay. So data compression can be accomplished by any particular algorithm you choose. And there's been a lot of criticism about this, but I am not a critic of it. can be accomplished by a specialized processor implementing what's called the advanced multiband excitation algorithm. This thing has been around since a very long time, actually, from the late 60s was the original development and then further implementation. The first AMBE processor was developed by a company called DVSI, whose stock I actually have, in 1997, and it was called the AMBE 1000 device, and it was used to produce a vocoder, which is an interesting buzzword term. Vocoder is a contraction of voice encoder. To compress the quantized voice signal, get this, from 64 kilobits per second to as low as 2.4 kilobits per second. Now, it's a lossy compression, which means it's not going to be perfect, but it does a pretty good job and certainly do an intelligible job when you're talking about communication and not trying to compress other things like voice or music in particular. We have other algorithms for doing a better job about that. So from 64 kilobits per second, this device can actually produce a data stream of compressed voice data to 2.4 kilobits per second. Here's an old shot of this device from 1997. It was made by Lucent, which is actually AT&T's second generation, third generation representation. The interesting thing, this chip was made in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which goes to show you here in eastern states, we all had a lot of Silicon Valley stuff going on, and then we lost it all. What can I tell you? This was AT&T Microelectronics in Allentown, which I had some interaction with, but that was the device as far as the compression is concerned. The company is called Digital Voice Systems Incorporated, DVSI. You can certainly look them up. They exist. So what is AMBE? Technically, I could probably spend quite a lot of time talking about it, but let me just give you the highlights here. AMBE is what's called a codebook-based vocoder that compresses, in this case, the 64 kilobits per second voice data to bit rates of between 2.4 and 9.6 kilobits per second, depending upon how much fidelity you want, at a sampling rate of 8 kilohertz within 20 millisecond frames. So it takes the 64 kilobit per second raw data in 20 millisecond frames and then compresses it down to a data stream of between 2.4 and 9.6 kilobits. So how does it do this? Well, the 20 millisecond frame of data is correlated to a pre-configured codebook of possible values by the processor to reduce the data rate. So it's called codebook-based vocoders. Now, the vocoder algorithm is actually language dependent, quite honestly, but the code can be modified very easily within the processor. The processor's codebook is not non-volatile. I mean, you can it's non-volatile. I mean, it's not non-volatile, it's volatile. You can actually rewrite the codebook. So if you want your processor to work in Finish or something like that, they have all these things done already. So the company's called DVSI. I'm getting back to amateur radio, believe it or not. So AMBE is based on the original multiband excitation vocoder algorithm. There was actually some work done in the 70s and even the late 60s, but certainly it came out in a sort of a public kind of a way from MIT in 1987 as a technical report. AMBE is quite endemic in digital communications. It's used by the MRSAT and the Iridium satellite telephony systems, and also APCO Project 25 public safety systems. And it turns out it's also used by amateur radio, as it turns out. So we're definitely staying along with the flow. So IMBE is used in the ICOM D-Star, DMR, and Yaesu System Fusion 2 amateur radio digital voice systems, and we'll talk about all of them. Now, there's a lot of things on circulating around the internet. AMBE has met some criticism from the amateur radio community because it's patented and licensing runs counter to the openness of amateur radio. In other words, you can't really hack it because it is patented and it runs on a processor. It's not software. There have been attempts by amateur radio to do things like something called free digital voice. It hasn't met with a lot of traction, quite honestly. But so I don't think it's a criticism, quite honestly, because I don't think people have actually done much with the device. They just wanted to criticize that it wasn't open. You know, you have to buy this device. So let me show you what amateur radio has done with it. The configuration, however, the configuration of this AMBE processor is open source. In other words, what do you have to do to get it to work is all open source. It's not closed by any means. The devices are readily available, and I do mean you could buy them in onesies and twosies if you're so inclined. And there are many amateur radio devices that are now available using the device. So here are some standalone devices, the so-called hotspot devices, and they'll have the AMB processor core to it. And here's the DV Mega DV stick, if you will, with the AMB processor core to it. So these are the experimenter or the standalone devices, if you will. But of course, the AMB processor is built already into our amateur radio digital voice transceivers, as we'll see. So here's a little bit of history on my part. I got into this in 1999. I purchased this from a group called Tapper, which is a Tucson amateur packet radio group, which has been around since the early 80s. And they produced right out of the box. This is the same device, except it's in a dip package, makes it a little bit easier to solder in place. And this is G4GUO, who's now a silent key now. But he basically took the device, put it on a board, put some devices around it, like an A to D converter and things like that, and produced a vocoder in 1999. So I would like you to get the sequence of chronology here. So 1999, hams are already playing with it, if you will. Even though the processor just came out, come out around 1997 or so with that device there. Okay. Well, I have a little personal things to say about this. This is my device in 2003. So I'll give the nod to the Temple University Amateur Radio Club, K3TU. We produced a vocoder using the second generation AMB 2020 in 2003. So this is our vocoder, if you will. Here's the AMB 2020. We have an A to D converter sitting right here, some support, the microprocessor and things like that. And this is a DSP device from Tapper, actually, that's doing the modulation, producing the carrier output. So that's our device in 2003. Here's the schematic for it. It was printed it was presented actually at the 2004 Tapper Digital Communications Conference, which happened to be up in Hartford. Usually they have these things like way out in Tucson and stuff like that. But when it gets to be in Hartford and Baltimore, I try to attend, or at least I used to be anyway. So that's the simple nature of the device. And this was running as a bidirectional vocoder, perfectly fine device anyway. Okay. So, the criticism, well, it's patented and whatever and all this stuff. Okay. I bought the device. I actually bought two of them. The AMB 2020 was available over the counter. They didn't give me a hard time about it. They were $22 a piece. Of course, 2003, that's a lot of money, but that's all it was. And it was actually a 2-arc through the ECE department senior design project. And it was configured to run the AMB protocol that was for ICOM D-Star. In fact, ICOM D-Star had published these settings for the AMB device. And that's how you can get all these things like the zoom spot and all these other things that can work, because the protocols are published, not only for D-Star, but also for DMR and also for Yaesu Fusion. There's nothing hidden there anyway. So we got it to work, and we could talk to my ID 51, which I still happen to have, and we got it to work anyway as a vocoder. Okay, so getting back to amateur radio. Amateur radio digital voice techniques all utilize now the 3rd and 4th generation AMB processor, if you will. They're up to the 3rd and 4th generation. So we're going to talk about D-Star first, do it in a chronological order, then we'll do DMR, and then we'll do Yaesu Fusion. All based on the the AMB processor, DVSI, buried within the hardware. Okay, so first out of the box, even though I produced this device in 2004 at the Digital Communications Conference, ICOM was showing off their D-Star stuff, which was really funny since I had a D-Star vocoder. But anyway, ICOM produced D-Star in 2004, the same year. The product was the IC2200H. This is still kicking around in many cases, which was 2-meter analog FM and digital voice transceiver using the 2020 device, as it turns out. The D-Star digital voice protocol has the voice signal sampled and quantized, of course, to 64 kilobits per second, but compressed and encoded as a 3.6 kilobit per second data using AMBE. You can take whatever data rate you want, depending upon the quality of the voice signal that you would expect to try to transmit. They opted for 3.6 kilobits per second. Now, Another aspect of digital communication is we don't often just transmit digital bits because they can be received in error. So we have some very, very robust data transmission techniques. So what ICOM did was add 1.2 kilobits per second to each one of these voice signals of something called forward error correction, resulting in a bit rate of 4.8 kilobits per second for the 2 meter, 70 centimeter, and 23 centimeter bands. What forward error correction can do is detect errors in the data transmission and to some extent fix the errors on reception. I always tell most engineering students is electrical engineering is very, very much akin to magic, because by putting this forward error correction, we can actually send data. If it gets corrupted, it can be detected and actually fixed at the other end. Not totally extensively, but certainly to some degree anyway. So that's called forward error correction. And we'll dedicate a goodly portion of our available data transmission rate just to forward error correction. This was for D-Star. Okay, now we have 4.8 kilobits per second, great. But if we used BASK and BPSK, according to the rules that I just outlined 4 times the data rate, we would still have an unacceptable 19.2. It's sort of at the high end, but it's still somewhat unacceptable for transmission, especially in the 2 meter band. And BFSK would be even worse. So what are we going to do about that? Well, what we're going to do is get rid of the primitive binary modulation techniques. So the D-Star digital voice protocol at 4.8 kilobits per second uses an advanced modulation technique. And again, we can go on for hours. This is not the 3 primitive ones that I showed you. This is called Gaussian minimum shift keying, or GMSK, to lower the transmission bandwidth to only 6 kilohertz instead of the 19.2, a little bit more acceptable as a result. So we can have a much more friendlier system on our available bands by going to 6 kilohertz bandwidth nominally. Okay, so that's ICOM. Still the same. And we could talk at the end, if you'd like, about the various pros and cons of each system, but that's ICOM, D-Star, first out of the box. Sort of about at the same time, digital mobile radio. It started as an open standard for digital voice, and it was defined by the European Telecommunications Standard Institute. It was first proposed in 2005, so it's not that old. But DMR, again, was designed for reduced transmission bandwidth and more users on a particular frequency by using not only data compression, but something called time division multiple access, TDMA. In fact, in my opinion, that's one of the reasons why it's not such a great system, because of TDMA. But we'll take a look at that too. Okay, DMR uses 8 bits of resolution. You've heard that before. 8 kilohertz again, resulting in 64 kilobits per second. 64 kilobits per second is compressed and then encoded as about a 2.45 kilobits per second, sort of at the lower end of quality, if you will. And that's probably why when people talk about DMR, that's one of the things that comes up. That's because the voice rate is around 2.45 kilobits per second. It has a very complex forward error correction protocol, which ups the data rate to about 3.6 kilobits per second. And I do mean complicated. I'm going to indicate this here. The DMR FEC forward error correction protocol is described in detail, but it's very complex in operation, to say the least. So we won't even get into it. It becomes a major endeavor to try to figure out, and it can't be figured out, basically how to do it. Okay, we'll let that go. But let's talk more about DMR. We saw that ICOM uses the Gaussian minimum shift keying, right? What does DMR use? Well, it doesn't use the same thing. It uses 4 frequency keying, or 4 FSK. This is not binary frequency shift keying. We saw that earlier. This is where we take 2 bits at a time, and we send that as one of 4 possible frequencies with respect to the carrier. So we'll take, here's our binary data. We'll just group them 2 bits at a time, called the die bit. And we'll take those 2 bits and we'll map it to 4 possible frequencies. So here in red, black, blue, and green, we have 4 possible frequencies depending upon the 4 possible die bits that I would get. 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and 1, 1 are the 4 possible cases. So these are the signals that I'm actually transmitting, 4 FSK or DMR. The die bits are offset with respect to the carrier in some kind of an oddball kind of a way. They're designed so that we don't get interference between the different shifting and things like that, causing spurious signals. That's what the oddball frequencies are all about. Sort of like same thing for touch tone, same thing occurs. Data compression then results in a data rate of 3.6 kilobits per second. But there's a problem here. There are two such channels available in DMR in terms of amateur radio use. That's what time division multiple access is all about. So DMR uses two 30-millisecond time slots where we basically have two users going back and forth, which allows two users to use the same frequency for transmission. Now in APCO P25 and all that, they can actually have different gradations. You can have 4 users and things like that. But we have picked, as for amateur radio, we've picked the simplest possible one with only 2 possible users at a time. So with 2 channels, 2 people talking at the same time, and 4 FSK modulation, the overall transmission is a little bit high. It's about 12.5 kilohertz, but that of course is also 2 users. You can compare that back to D-Star, which is around 6 kilohertz or so. But again, this is 2 people talking at the same time. One of the problems with DMR is if you stop talking and somebody starts talking, you can lose your time slot. If you haven't operated DMR, you don't know exactly what I mean. And if you have, you do know what I mean. So you have to keep the chatter up, otherwise you lose it. Okay, so that's DMR. Now, sort of very late in the overall scheme of things, we've had D-Star, we had DMR, and people had spent some time buying D-Star repeaters and DMR repeaters and all that. And rather late in the game, in 2015, a full decade later, Yaesu introduced System Fusion 2. There was an earlier version, but it wasn't very popular. As it turns out, it was just called System Fusion. They called it System Fusion 2 to implement digital voice. The first products of any note in the newer system were the FTM 100 DR and the FTM 400, if you will, both of which I happen to have. Very good units, I think, anyway. 2015. So let's look at System Fusion, compare and contrast. System Fusion also uses 8 bits of resolution, sampled again at 8 kilohertz, 64 kilobits. So everybody seems to use the same input standard, if you will. But it's compressed and encoded as 4.4 kilobits per second. Again, you can compare and contrast the different quality based upon how many bits you're going to donate to the voice transmission after compression. This one's 4.4 kilobits per second, which is one of the higher ones. And again, for robust data transmission, we're going to add a lot of forward error correction. We're going to do 2.8 kilobits per second, resulting in a bit rate of about 7.2 kilobits per second for the fundamental voice mode anyway, of System Fusion. System Fusion digital voice is a complex protocol with several modes of operation. To tell you the truth, it's all perfectly open source. Everything is described, and you can certainly build your own radio if you want. Many people have done similar things with experimentation. There are frame headers, terminators, additional information that raises the overall data rate to about 9.6 kilobits per second. And again, the technical publication is available. There's nothing that they're holding back except how to do it. Okay. Yaesu has provided a complete description of the protocol with frame composition, do this and then do that, and header and terminator composition, do this and do that. It's much easier just to go buy a radio, quite honestly. Notice that the vocoder that we built in 2003, 2004 did D-Star, which had a much easier protocol to put together, get it to work. I haven't even tried to do this one. Okay. If the System 2 digital voice protocol is running at 7.2 kilobits per second with the FEC added in, forget BASK and BPSK, we would get 28.8 kilohertz, and BFSK would be even greater. So obviously we're not going to use those primary modes, fundamental modes either. What did they do? They're calling it C4FM. It's a variation, it's a special type of 4FSK as in DMR, but it's also they call it C4FM, continuous 4-level frequency modulation for a transmission bandwidth of 12.5 kilohertz, which is lower than the 28.8 and still within acceptable range. C4FM is a special case of 4FSK having to do with the transitions between different die bits, as in DMR, with intentionally smoother transitions with each symbol level and therefore resulting in lower bandwidth. Much better modulation in general than DMR. Okay, Now, C4FM is used in conjunction with what's called frequency division multiple access, and DMR uses 4FSK, but is impaired because of the use of TDMA. I pointed out that that's because you're having two people talk at the same time. These are very interesting terms. So here's a little graphic that describes them. Frequency division multiple access means that we take our frequency band, we divide it up into bands, and those are different, essentially, information streams. This is very much like we get in the broadcast band, right? We get each broadcast channel is sitting in each in a different band, not interfering with each other. So literally, broadcast radio, FM, AM, or whatever, is frequency division. Time division multiple access is we're going to take the entire range of frequencies available, but we're going to break it up into time slots, and that's what DMR does. A little bit different than what C4FM does. Okay, C4FM and FDMA is the same mode that's used in APCO 25, P25 phase 1, public service, but it's not compatible with system fusion at the level of the protocol. They're not going to talk to one another. C4FM, just like DMR, uses 4 frequency shift keying 2 bits at a time, called the die bit. And here's the frequency offsets that they have for either wide or narrow. These are 2 different modulation methods that they have within their protocol, digital wide or digital narrow. Okay, guess what? We're getting to the end. So finally, what good is digital voice? Well, linking repeaters have been done somewhat primitively in amateur radio on analog FM with Echolink for decades. Echolink is sort of a hybrid. You take an analog signal, make it digital, send it over the internet and all that. And that's literally has been around for well over 2 decades. But generally, routing and access has been limited. Also, the setup and the quality and all that is somewhat suspect even after all these years. On the other hand, digital voice systems are much more amenable to such routing and access. And we can see that in a couple of different systems, not only D-Star, but also DMR and also Yaesu Fusion. And here in MARC, we have 2 repeaters, 444050 Darby and 445675 Paoli, are both using Yaesu System Fusion 2 in various stages of repair or disrepair. The MARC 445675 is currently node connected by Steve K3ZFT to the Keystone Wide Digital Net. I highly recommend that you put out a couple of calls on there, and you'd be surprised who might come back to you. I always try to shake it up a little bit, and you get people talking all over the state. And I hope we could put Eastern Pennsylvania on the map a little bit. Most of the repeaters that have signed into this are out in Western and Central Pennsylvania. So hopefully this will continue to grow, hopefully. The 050 Darby repeater will be node connected after repair, and we'll think about maybe what we might be able to do with linking the 2 repeaters together for increased coverage. But after all of that, that's wonderful and all of that. Is digital voice a better performer than analog FM? And this we can actually obtain measurements of and make a quantitative decision, not a qualitative decision about whether it's good or not. So is it better than analog FM? Well, here's a study that somebody did, not me, but because of forward error correction and digital modulation, the various digital voice techniques, this one is actually testing Yaesu Fusion at a slightly better level and then fall off precipitously. So this upper curve here is the performance metrics, signal plus noise ratio versus the received signal ratio. And you know this from your cell phone, that basically everything is fine until you lose it. Then it just drops off like the end of the world. You just completely lose your signal. So that's literally what happens with digital voice. Whereas on the other hand, analog FM performs poorer and poorer until, basically you can't even hear the guy anymore. So basically it performs poor and degrades slowly. So you can see the curve here anyway, that digital will basically hang in there with perfectly sounding, no noisy representation for a lot longer, whereas analog is getting continuously noisier. And you can go back and forth and do various comparisons. Yaesu Fusion FM actually allows us to do this because our repeaters are in automatic mode selection. So you can try both in digital and then you can switch over to analog and see what the difference is. And certainly it might be for things at the periphery, you might be able to see this particular performance metric. Okay. So wrapping it all up, digital voice implementation and applications, along with everything else we do in amateur radio, APRS, which has been around since the late 70s and the 80s. WSJT, the weak signal modes, including AFT8. AMSAT, LEO satellite that we put up, and also mesh networks that are endemic in Montgomery County, but hopefully moving a little bit more south as time goes on. They demonstrate to the FCC that amateur radio remains technically vibrant and ensures our continued relevance. If we don't have technical vibrancy, I think the FCC would say, well, it's a bunch of, whatever. And I think all of these things all put together show that it is. That, along with the other tenets of amateur radio, the public service, emergency communication, STEM outreach for technical training and things like that. I think it all adds to the overall pot. And certainly by having digital techniques like this, we're certainly keeping up with the way the current state of the art is. Okay, that's it. Are there any questions, comments, rave reviews, tip jars, anything?
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. That was great. Questions?
I noticed you talked about System Fusion 2.
Yes, that's what they call it.
Is that compatible with the original System Fusion?
No,
No.
no. The protocol is different. These were the first radios that did System Fusion 2. I've never really, I don't really remember. I tried to research it, but I think Yaesu tried to suppress the earlier versions, literally. And they just, I don't know what happened, but basically they just got rid of it quickly because it didn't really do a good job.
Okay.
These were,
Yeah, I have the 400. So that's version 2.
that's version 2, yes, current protocol. And that started around 2015. There were some, again, failed attempts a little bit earlier, but I think they finally got their act together. The other reason I think I like Yaesu's attempt is that their repeaters are bimodal. They will do both analog and digital. Their repeaters are also dual band. You can put them on 2 meters or 440 and one reason they are is they literally have 2 FTM 400s in the box. That's how they can do that. Whereas D-Star, you get 1 band and you get digital only, which is kind of a bummer. And they were quite expensive to begin with. Here in the MARC Club, we've been pretty good. Every time Yaesu cuts the price as a club impetus, we jump right on it and try to keep that. We just bought 2 DR 2Xs for, what was the 2? I don't even forget. I think it was like $1,300 for 2 repeaters, which is like a fire sale. So that's pretty good. I think they're really doing a lot to try to promote it. Plus they'll operate on AM. I mean, analog FM too. Any other questions, comments?
Brian, your FTM 400
is now out of production.
Right, but the FTM 400 differs from the FTM 400 XDR only by the GPS.
Yeah, they improved the GPS, yeah.
They improved the GPS in the XDR version.
But it's no longer being offered. It's if you get one now because they're out of production. They now have the FTM 500, which doesn't even look as nice, to tell you the truth. This is a touch screen. It's really a beautiful radio. I have 2 of these. I'm seriously thinking, if my wife won't kill me, to get another one and just put it in a box on the shelf.
I think it might be too late, Dennis.
Might be too late, yeah.
Yeah, I think I checked around. They're pretty much all gone. So I have 3 of them. I love that radio.
Yeah, mine is the 400D.
I just bought an FTM 100 on fire sale on eBay. So I have FTM 100 too now.
Yeah, my 400 is the 400D, not the XDR.
The only difference is GPS, Brian.
Yeah, that's what I understand.
There are no specs on the FTM 500, but it doesn't have, it's got a color display, but a lot smaller than the 400. You can go on Gigaparts or a couple other websites. They have it there, but they say it's not available currently, that kind of stuff. We'll have to see. There are a couple of other current radios in what they have available, yeah.
maybe I'll stir the pot a little bit. So if all of these methods are basically open source protocols and they all use the same hardware, why can't I buy a radio that does them all? Right? Just
Good
press a
question.
button on DMR, Fusion, D-Star, P25.
There was a rumor maybe, I don't know, 5-8 years ago that Kenwood was going to do that, and it never happened. So I'm not sure. You'll notice that Kenwood doesn't have anything in this vein at all.
So they haven't picked a horse in
They
this
haven't
race.
kicked the can down the road yet. They're making too much.
Kenwood,
They're making-
Kenwood,
They say the protocol is open, but
Yeah, it is open.
that's problematic because, I mean, up until maybe a year or two ago, the only place you could get D-Star was on, it was from ICOM.
Kenwood's been making D-Star radios for half a dozen years, but Kenwood and ICOM have NXN. What is it? NDNX.
Yeah, the public.
NXDN.
XDN is locked up. Only Kenwood and ICOM are making those radios. But any Pi Star running current software and an MMDVM hat will do cross mode into any of these digital modes. So effectively, you get a multi-mode radio with any of the MMDVM hatted Pi Star hotspots, or this one, same thing. I use my FTM 5D to go on DMR with this all the time. Let me just tease April a little bit. First off, I move the node away from the Keystone State room for Fusion digital nets, particularly on Monday evenings, the MinWiz, that's Minnesota, Wisconsin room, technical net, that's been running for a dozen years. It's excellent and high level. It's 8:30 p.m. Eastern time, and I move the room to that. On Wednesday evenings, I move the room to the digital learning net, which comes out of the Sky Hub system in Denver. On Sundays, I move the node to the New England Fusion Group's technical net, which is at 3 p.m. on Sundays. There are several other digital technical nets that I'm will spend a little time with once I get home, and I may move the node for those as well. Other than that, our repeater is open for you to move to the room of your choice, so long as you do so courteously, making sure that it's not in active use by someone else, and by announcing yourself and your intent to move the room, waiting for a response before doing so. But our repeaters are open to be moved. You can move the room and join other activities elsewhere in the world.
Thank you, Steve. This is on the MARC website. I brought it up here. It's on the screen. Everything you just said is on the MARC website, and keep checking and make sure it's correct when you get a chance.
I will. Thank you.
All right, are there other questions? All right, if not,
Here's the bad boy on 220, right here. First thing I want to do is shut it off. Okay.
so if there's nothing else for Dennis, let's thank him for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, good job, Dennis.
Thanks, Dennis.
And I think that will adjourn this evening's meeting. So thanks all for joining us, and we will see you again for the March MARC meeting, and that will be held on, let's look it up here. Convenient that we have it on the website, March 28th, and our presenter will be Alan Johnston, KU2Y, and he'll be telling us about amateur radio activities at Villanova University. Or we may see you at some other events in the meantime. We do have the breakfast, which looks like it'll be on March 18th. And of course, the Vietnam Vets public service event on March 25th. So with that, I will say 7-3, and we will